all of us are accountable to the people of Seattle and delivering real results. And I think that that's going to be the way we're going to resolve this friction, is by working together, by working collaboratively. We can get resources out there for people that are really in need, and we can make a difference. And I think that we saw that with the COVID relief bill, and hopefully we can repeat that with our police restructuring efforts.
The words of Councilmember Andrew Lewis talking about resolving the conflict between the Seattle City Council and Mayor Jenny Durkan, especially over police budgeting. Those efforts really kicking into high gear as the council returns from its summer recess. Welcome back, everybody, to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, the public affairs podcast that always thought recess was the best period of the school day. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. I'm also a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. I am joined by Kevin Schofield of Seattle City Council Insight. After a 2-week hiatus, it is very good to see you, sir.
We got the band back together again.
Let's do it, man. Let's do it. The duo's rocking here. All right. Our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast is City Grind Espresso from the first floor of City Hall, closed during the pandemic, but we thank them for their help. Thanks also to Converge Media. If you're watching this right now, it's thanks to Converge. We appreciate them airing the video version of this podcast. And last but not least, our supporters on Patreon. So important to us. Catherine just signed on recently. Thank you so much, Catherine. We really do need you folks in terms of supporting this. Your support keeps this podcast going. So if you can be a patron of independent journalism, we really invite you to do this. All right, we're going to get things going with right here, right now. Okay, so what is happening right now in Seattle area politics? The City Council back in session after a 2-week summer recess, a ton on the agenda, approving an interfund loan to keep work going on the West Seattle Bridge, cleaning up some land use bills. But I really want to talk about something, Kevin, to start that is not specifically on the agenda, and I want to get everybody up to speed here. So the mayor vetoed the council's latest attempt at rebalancing the 2020 budget right at the start of the council recess on August 21st. 30 days after that, the council is required to make a decision. Do we override that veto? Do we sustain it? And Kevin, I'm just thinking this date of September 21st is going to be fast upon us. What do you expect the council to do?
Well, so, I mean, they really have 3 options, one of which isn't an option. The option that really doesn't exist for them is just sustaining the veto, because they're actually required to have a balanced budget, right? If they just sustain the mayor's veto, we're back to where we were at the end of May, which is, we have a budget that's $300 million out of whack or more, at this point.
Right.
So, the 2 options they have is they can override it, but the problem with that is they can't actually force the mayor to spend money that they're allocating if she doesn't want to spend it.
Yeah.
So really the best option for them is to cut a deal with the mayor. And, while they've been, noticeably quiet over the last 2 weeks, they will, I expect there's going to be a deal. Right.
Yeah.
And I think, part of that is I'm not sure there's this broad public support for the city council's position in this as they really thought there was going into their 2020 budget rebalancing session. Right. And so the political winds may have shifted a little bit on that.
Yeah, and I think about it too. The last time this budget issue came through and the mayor issued her first veto there, I think we saw there was a little bit of a shift in the council there in terms of Lewis and Peterson, council members Lewis and Peterson. They voted to sustain the mayor's veto, just I think as a way to kind of move the ball forward. Councilmember Juarez, if you remember, was not present at that meeting to vote. I feel like she might be in that camp of trying to negotiate a little bit more. So really, we're not talking about, I don't think, that override piece at all here. We're talking about some sort of deal where we can have a more unified council, a more unified mayor going forward with this, Kevin.
Right. And I think they're responding to what they're hearing from the community too, which is that, Seattle community doesn't want to see the city council and the mayor at odds with each other and, just bickering constantly about this stuff. They want us, we've got a lot of big problems. And I think there are a lot of people in the city who really want to see everybody moving together and city government united around this.
Yeah, for sure. I think the fact that the mayor and the council agreed on some COVID relief right before the council's recess might indicate some agreement going forward. And I should also point out, it's very important to see that the 2021 budget process is set to start before the end of September. So at a certain point, you really wonder if there are enough hours in the day to figure this out, but a lot still ahead on that one. But I want to jump back to the agenda here, if I could, with you, Kevin, with looking at the council here in this first week after Labor Day, an important issue that some people might have lost in the shuffle, an approval vote scheduled for 2 measures on electric scooter share. So the council is saying scooters could be a good alternative to mass transit as we emerge from the COVID crisis, could be good for the environment, might even help alleviate some of the problems from the closed down West Seattle Bridge. The Seattle Department of Transportation is talking about 1,500 scooters to start, maybe building this up to 6,000. But just the bigger issues here, Kevin, I think a huge one here is safety. And I want to try to break this down. You wrote a really good piece on scooters on SCC Insight.
Yeah, this is something I've been writing about a number of times over the years. As the bike share and then the scooter share kind of played themselves out. And scooter share is something that there's been a lot of political pressure to move forward on, but the safety issues, particularly when you look at other cities, have been fairly consistent and fairly dramatic in some cases. SDOT has put together a proposal that they think addresses a lot of the safety issues. Requiring helmets, not allowing scooter riding on sidewalks.
Right.
But there are a couple of issues. One of which, big one, is around enforcement of wearing helmets, enforcement of not riding on the sidewalks, and enforcement of the equity issues, making sure that the vendors that they permit to do this actually distribute the scooters to low-income communities, right, and provide special low-income plans, right? But what SDOT is saying, they've got half to 2/3 of a plan together, and they keep, when they were presenting this to the city council, one of the things they said over and over again is, we're trying to be nimble about this, we're trying to be scrappy, we want to be flexible and respond, which is kind of a nice way of saying they don't really have it all worked out yet, and they're going to do some of this on the fly, and that can be, that makes me a little nervous to hear them saying that, right? That they have learned some lessons from other jurisdictions, but they're bowing to the pressure to move forward quickly on this. And a couple of council members, particularly council member
Peterson's opposed to it. I know that. The
Peterson's opposed to
share,
so some of the council members have said, look, at this point, the way forward is we can't let this be an academic exercise anymore.
Right. I know Strauss was saying that.
Reinforcing what SDOT has been saying, like we've got to get out there and get something going and then adjust from there.
Right. The thing that it really interests me, though, in terms of pushing this forward, I think it really brings to bear that Seattle's bicycle master plan is nowhere near where it should be for a build out like this potentially. And that's an issue. I mean, certainly in the South End, Councilmember Morales was talking about that. Let's talk infrastructure a little bit, Kevin, because I think that's a missing piece, too, that certainly plays into the safety issue.
Yeah. And I mean, the good news is while we've all been staying at home, SDOT has actually been busy building out bike lanes, right?
Yeah,
and connecting.
true.
They've been doing a lot in the South End, down through Soto, down to South Seattle. Building out more of that, which helps. Yeah. But it's hard to say. So they're filling in some of the major connectivity holes,
right?
But it's hard to say it's really a network. Although one of the things they are saying is that, and we're going to talk more about what's going on in West Seattle with the West Seattle Bridge closure later, that scooter share could play an important part of sort of the last mile coverage of how they get people to and from the water taxi and other major transit hubs. So we get fewer individuals driving in their own cars and more people using mass transit to the extent it's safe, and other kinds, bicycles and scooters and other things to just prevent us from overloading the roads that we have while the bridge is closed.
I think it's important to point out, though, this is a really interesting piece for me in terms of making sure that these scooters are safe. I just wonder if enough of the casual commuters will buy in to go for that last mile piece, because as it stands right now, these scooters will have a top speed of 15 miles per hour, but that first ride, you'll be limited to 8 miles an hour. So I think about people putting along there, not that 8 miles an hour is super slow. I mean, faster than I can run, I guess. But in terms of doing something like that, I just wonder if enough people are going to be enamored of this scooter share as it comes out there to use it frequently to make the dent that SDOT is hoping this scooter share will make.
And there's some interesting questions there. Right? Most of our residential streets now are 20 miles per hour, not 25 anymore.
That's right.
The city reduced that. So 15 miles per hour is not that far less than that.
Yeah.
And the 8 miles per hour, there was some debate with the city council about this. They said, why make that just the first ride? Why not make it, the first 5
Every
rides?
Ride.
Or something like that?
Right.
And SDOT brought up the very issue that you just raised, which is at some point, people say, oh, well, yeah, this is too slow. This isn't really an option.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
figured, okay, we'll do the first ride and make sure the first time people try one of these things, they don't go too fast in that.
Yeah.
But after that, 15 miles per hour.
Yeah, that's going to be a very delicate balance as SDOT rolls that out.
We'll see what it does to entry rates. And SDOT, is committed. They say they're committed to studying that, to funding Harborview Hospital and
they'll be working on the safety piece. Yeah,
and UW Medical Center to actually study injury rates.
Yep. So a lot still ahead with that one. Thanks for that breakdown, Kevin. Let's move on to Now Hear This. All right, so our soundbite of the week comes from Interim Police Chief Adrian Diaz talking about transferring a number of officers within the department. Here's what he said at a September 2nd press conference.
So today, I'm announcing an initial step to enhance our 911 response capacity. Working with our command team and the unions, we're redeploying 100 personnel into 911 response.
The chief's first official appearance in his new role, making an announcement that has a lot more to it than just shifting 100 officers. Kevin, to begin, the timing of this. There was a recent Seattle Times article that showed at least one SPD officer made more than $414,000 in 2019, the highest paid employee in the city. A lot of that due to overtime, which has been a years-long issue for the SPD. I think the chief was definitely trying to put a little bit of water on that fire to start with. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the officer made $414,000, worked a lot of hours.
Yeah, true,
true. And obviously with overtime rates being higher than regular rates, he made a lot of money doing that.
Right.
I think the issue for me, the big issue that raises is an issue of fatigue. We know officers make more mistakes, and they're more prone to use excessive force when they are fatigued and overworked, right?
Yeah,
so
basically it looked like 2 years worth of work was crammed into one from what the hours said, at least.
Right. And that raises serious issues about whether there should be a cap on the number of overtime hours that any particular officer should work. To me, that's a bigger concern than did he make $414,000. Right? Is a pattern of working that many hours really a good thing for public safety?
Yeah, and it's an accounting issue too, Kevin, in terms of how those hours are counted up. As I understand it, it's still a paper slip that officers are filling out. This has been a constant back and forth with the council and the SPD for many years.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of issues in there. Issues like if they're on call, they get partial pay for that. If they're on standby, then it's a minimum of 3 hours. But you know what? There are those same, the city council just went through and put those same kinds of provisions in their labor regulations for restaurant workers.
Yes, right.
To say, hey, look, if you're on call, you get partial pay.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And so, I think we get in a difficult situation if we say that that's appropriate for one kind of work, but not necessarily appropriate for other kinds of work.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe it makes sense to make differentiate, but nobody's having that kind of nuanced debate about this right now.
That's a very good point. I wanted to get into some more of the details here. So the chief and the mayor really presented this as a way to improve 911 response times. But we've talked about this, Kevin. The stats are showing 56% of the calls that are coming in are non-criminal calls. So in looking at this, I think I saw a nod toward the city council in some ways in the fact that a lot of these officers that are talking about being transferred here would transfer out of specialty units which the council has targeted for cuts. But in the end, Kevin, it almost felt to me like the chief was trying to protect jobs for his officers here behind this cover of we need better 911 response. How do you see that issue?
Well, I think there's a lot of the interim chief Diaz and SPD on one hand, and the critics on the other hand, talking across each other.
Yeah, right.
What Diaz said was this move was about three things. Number one, it was about reducing 911 response times. And he says that the number one issue that he hears across the city is that it is about police presence and how quickly people respond to 911 911 calls. Right. And it's good that people are thinking about alternatives to having armed police officers show up to a bunch of these things. And, the police department and the mayor are thinking about that as well as the city council.
But sometimes these things escalate.
But we don't have those other solutions right now. Right. And when somebody calls 911, they want somebody to show up.
Yeah.
Today, the default, for better or for worse, is the police,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And in some parts of the city, the response time is really high, particularly in the north end of the city.
Yeah.
So that's issue number one. Issue number two that he's trying to address with it is to actually reduce overtime.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Say we've got more officers doing this, and we can spread the load across them, and we're
Mhm.
not to make, because they have minimum requirements for the number of patrol officers that they have on duty in a given
That's
time,
right.
right?
Mhm.
And if they need to use overtime to meet those minimums, then that racks up a lot of overtime hours.
Yeah.
And then the third issue is a really interesting one. Diaz said that what he's trying to do with this is deal with a problem they have today, which is that the patrol officers are basically going from 911 call to 911 call.
Yeah. They don't have time.
all day long, and they never get a chance to spend any time in the community, right?
Yeah.
They don't get to meet people in the community. They don't get
Right.
to build relationships.
Right.
So he's hoping by doing this that he's freeing up some time for the officers to prevent them from just having to do, back-to-back calls
Yeah.
all day, and let them actually build the kinds of relationships in the community that we
Yeah.
all want them to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the meantime, the critics are saying, hey, look, adding more police patrol officers doesn't increase public safety.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right. That's
and so both sides are right about this, but they're
Yeah.
talking across each other.
Yeah, I think you're onto something here, and I think when we get into the real deep details here, I just wonder how this is going to be negotiated with the police officers union, the guild there, when it comes to how this is all going to shake out. I know the chief had said he had SPOG's support for this, but the Office of Professional Accountability has some concerns about this, and potentially with more officers leaving. If older officers who have been on the force for a while, if they get the order, hey, guess what, you're going to patrol, they might end up retiring. I think that's an interesting piece here that still hasn't played out yet.
Yeah. So, in the SPOG contract, there's rules for these kinds of transfers.
Yes.
And mostly the rules about, who gets to, have opportunities to do that. And if somebody's, position is being moved to a different department, what are their options in terms of, going with that position or going to a different one.
Yeah.
So, this is a case where SPOG's role is not as much to say yes or no as it would be, with entire units being dissolved
Yeah.
or, overall reductions in headcount.
Yeah.
But it's more an issue about SPOG ensuring that the rules that are in the contract get followed.
Yeah. Right.
So I don't think SPOG is really going to be an impediment
Yeah.
to moving 100 officers around. They're just going to make sure that the process is followed and their officers get a chance to look at, do I want that new job, or do I want to apply for a different job somewhere somewhere else in the department to the extent that there are openings.
Right. And I think too, it's going to be, I just felt like this idea of transferring officers rather than cutting officers, which the council is definitely talking about. I think that's a little bit of the argument that's going to go ahead here. And I think one last challenge on this one, Kevin, we don't know exactly which specialty units would see the transfers here exactly. And I know the council has talked a lot about the navigation team. They've wanted to defund that team entirely. That's the other pice that needs to fall into place.
Yeah, and the sense, so two comments there. Just going back to the first thing you said there, my sense only came from this is this is fairly orthogonal to the question of cuts. Right?
Yeah.
This is just Diaz having a different approach to optimizing the staff that he has right now.
Okay.
But then, to your second point.
Yeah, with regard to bringing officers out of specialty units such as the navigation team.
This looks like it's what Diaz has said so far is it looks like he's trying to peanut butter this across all of the different specialty units. So he said explicitly he did, the intent here is not to shut down any of the specialty units. Right? Doing, many of them doing very, very important work. If the domestic violence unit suddenly got to the point where they're below critical mass, there'd be a problem. And so one of the things that he's going to be doing, he said, is watching the number, watching the sort of the caseload and the progression of cases through each of these specialty units, with the remaining headcount to make sure that nothing terrible has happened to any of them, but that they're still managing to move forward with the cases that they have.
All right. Thanks for the breakdown. Let's move on to what's next.
We're right here at East Precinct. It doesn't get any closer than this right now. Converge Media produces culturally relevant content for Black and urban audiences. Our coverage is raw, transparent, and objective,
praised by community leaders, government officials, and residents. As a small independent media company, we rely on the financial support of individuals and business members to stay on the front lines of the news that's important to you.
Okay, we're going to try to break down two big court cases here. Kevin, first one up, Shay Taylor, a wrongful death suit in U.S. District Court. Taylor, of course, shot and killed by Seattle police in 2016, a big story here in the Seattle area. His family filing this civil case. It looks like we're getting closer to trial here, and much of this, it looks like, Kevin, and I read your coverage on this, is going to hinge on the credibility of the officers involved, if they had probable cause to arrest Taylor when they shot him. Try to talk about some of the issues you're hearing in court on this, please.
Yeah, so what happened this week was the judge in the case handled there was an outstanding motion for summary judgment by the city and the police officers to dismiss a bunch of the charges.
Yeah.
And he didn't dismiss everything, but he dismissed some of the plaintiffs, some of the defendants. There were, a couple of backup officers who really weren't directly involved with the shooting.
Right.
And he sort of dismissed them from the case.
Got it.
So it's still the city and the two main arresting officers in the case.
Spalding and Miller.
He eliminated some of the plaintiffs and just said they don't really have standing to sue over this in a civil case.
Right.
Narrowed a few of the claims but at this point the case is ready to move forward to trial. And originally the trial was going to be in the middle of June.
Right.
But then COVID happened. Right. And in fact, at this point, the U.S. District Court is still closed. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So they're not at the moment allowed to even have an in-person trial.
Right.
So, a big question here is going to be, are the parties willing to have a trial all online, over Zoom or something like that? And there are other, county, state, and federal cases that are doing exactly that, right? But if the plaintiffs say, no, we really want the jury to be able to be in the same room as these police officers and looking them straight in the eye when they judge whether they're credible or not, then we're going to wait.
Yeah.
We're going to wait until we can really do a live jury trial on that. So there's going to be a bunch of issues around that. And, the judge in ruling earlier this week said, this case, it's not really he said, she said.
Yeah.
It's they said he's dead. Right?
Yeah.
Because Shay Taylor can't testify.
Right. And that would be it.
And, and there were a couple of other witnesses who were in the car that Shay Taylor had just gotten out of when he was shot.
Yeah.
But their testimony so far one of them has not been particularly credible as a witness, and the other was not, particularly helpful. He didn't really either, contradict or
side,
corroborate, the police officers or, what the plaintiffs have said on this. So at this point, it's the testimony of the police officers.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of mostly obscured, police dash cam video.
Yeah.
And mostly, it goes on the credibility of the police officers. There are, the biggest kind of factual question on this is, how this came about was the officers 30 minutes before the shooting had seen Shay Taylor, and one of the two officers said, I saw him carrying a gun and a holster on his right hip.
Right.
And then Shay Taylor went inside apartment building.
Yeah.
Came out a little bit later, jumped in a car, left.
Right.
Came back 30 minutes later, and that's when the shooting happened.
Right. And the judge is saying you needed to reestablish the fact that you had a gun. I mean, that's a big piece. Yeah.
Having a gun was the reason for arresting him. As
that's
a
right.
felon, being in possession of a firearm was illegal and was cause for arrest.
That probable cause,
So 30 minutes later, after, did they still have probable cause to arrest him? That's going to be an issue, and it relates to, both whether the shooting was justified at the moment, but it also relates to sort of some bigger legal issues about whether police officers have what's called qualified immunity.
Yes, this is another piece.
A huge, big, political hairball right now. It's that the U.S. Supreme Court is being pushed really hard now to address, and and it may be that this case ends up being one more case put in front of the U.S. Supreme Court potentially.
Yeah.
They've so far declined to take up issues on qualified immunity, but
Right.
given what's happened now over the summer, they may decide that they want to take it up.
I certainly hope so, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see this go to a jury here. So thanks for that breakdown. Can we touch?
There is the larger question I think is really important in this case, which is, could you even seat a jury?
Yeah,
this, right?
yeah.
Given how the strong feelings that everybody has on one side or another,
sure,
on
nationwide,
on police violence, here locally, and after all the protests and violence over the summer,
you bet,
but nationally as well, right?
Yeah.
Who's qualified to sit objectively on a jury for this? That's if you're one of the thousands of people who over the summer participated in a protest against police violence, right? Does that disqualify you?
Oh, that's you're disqualifying a lot of people if that's the case there.
I think it's going to be tough, but I think it's going to be. I mean, it's not like they could even move it to a different town or city, right? Because the issues are going to be pretty much everywhere.
Can I touch quickly on another court case with you, Kevin? A group of Seattle landlords suing Mayor Durkan, Governor Inslee over the constitutionality of city and state eviction moratoria, more than one moratorium, during the pandemic. Do the landlords have a case here? Can we talk about this one briefly, please?
Yes, this was filed late last week. It's a new case. It's filed by a bunch of landlords. The law firm representing them is a Pacific Legal Foundation, which is a champion of conservative causes. They're the ones who went after the city's first-in-time tenant protection law and its fair chance housing tenant protection law. So they're kind of experienced at suing the city, and this time they're suing both the state and the city. We've got eviction moratoriums in place. Moratoria. I'll pull the Latin card.
Yeah, there we go. Had to be done.
By the governor and by executive order, by the mayor by executive order, and then the Seattle City Council extended for another 6 months the mayor's executive order. Right. And so at one level, the heart of this question is, to the extent that they're both federal and state constitutional rights, such as the government not being allowed to impair contracts, and property rights, not being able to do a taking of property without just compensation, during an emergency. To what extent does the government have to curtail those rights?
That's exactly it.
And there's a lot of case history going back, over 100 years, but certainly, the major ones, there was kind of a big push around this starting with the Great Depression. And at the federal level, and then at the state level, there was a major case after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. That relate to these issues around, what can the government do that might, curtail these kinds of rights? And largely, sort of at both levels, the government, the courts have said that while the federal and the U.S. and state constitutions don't explicitly say, the government may curtail these constitutional rights, in cases of emergency, the courts have said that there's this implied responsibility of the government to maintain public health and safety. Right.
That's the big piece of this.
So if they, the logic for them said, what's the point of maintaining contracts without public health and safety? Right. I mean, it's meaningless to have, I've got this contract and it's still in force. Yeah, but we don't have public health and safety, right? The economy is crumbling. We have no civil society. But we've got a contract. Right? That just makes no sense. So clearly, at some level, the government's responsibility to maintain public health and safety kind of overrides these other things. But the question is, for how long? Right?
How long are they going to be able to stretch
the courts love their 4-part test for this, and they got a 4-part test for this too, right? That goes into talking about, so what is the situation? Right. Does the government's response to that address the situation? And how narrowly tailored is the response to specifically address, or does it go too far? Right. In this case, you could say, if the governments had issued a 1-month moratorium on evictions, that's
one thing.
There'd be no issues. If they did a 10-year moratorium on them. Everyone
That's
go,
the other end of the
okay,
spectrum.
that's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So somewhere in between 1 month and 10 years, there's a threshold where this no longer seems reasonable. Right? And the courts hate this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? they don't want to be able to say, they don't want to be forced to say, well,
Date
okay,
X,
11 months of moratorium is
Mhm.
fine, but 12 months, that's just going too far.
Right.
But so, they like bright lines of saying like, no, here's the logic why this is good and this is bad. But this is kind of where this is going to. They're in a couple different dimensions being asked to say, does this moratorium go too far?
All right. Well, we got to wrap up the show here. And we usually finish up the Coffee Break podcast here with some baked goodness. We've sampled the small bakeries around Seattle, a ton of them, women and black-owned bakeries. Make sure you keep doing that, folks. Some home baking, too. Kevin, the baking continues in my home. I'll try to show you here the beignet that my daughter made for me here. Yeah, so
nice.
It's cool. So, it's just a little kind of pouch of wonderful dough here. Heat it up, get a little butter on it, and a little bit of powdered sugar. I don't know what it is about these treats here, but these the simple ones, I think, almost make more sense to me sometimes.
Beignets, they're just great comfort food.
Mm-hmm. Oh, man. That's comforting, all right. That's good stuff. Kevin will be back with some more baking soon, I promise. So it won't be just my daughter's baking for us. All right, Kevin, thank you once again for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Brian.
All right. The next time you want to know what's going on with local politics, as I keep chewing here, make sure you give us a listen on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Find out what's brewing. You can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you listen. And please support us on Patreon if you like what you're hearing. Thanks again to Converge Media for airing our podcast. And as always, everybody, thanks for listening.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.